train has left the station and no one can stop it. And it looks like that, and I believe that we are getting close to the last days of possible rethinking and reconsidering of everything that is happening in Ukraine. If those big powers don't do anything in a short period of time, yes, I'm pretty much certain that we'll face a real disaster. If you bet on a fact that someone is bluffing, it means that you have no better cards. But you just believe that the other side has weaker cards. And you're not sure about it because you don't know and you didn't see his or their cards. Everybody is speaking only about war. Nobody wants to reach the peace. Nobody speaks about peace. Peace is almost a forbidden word. And please notice this. Because they say we need to win in order to secure future peace, but nobody's speaking about a peace, and then, okay, you negotiate it.
Dear readers, good afternoon. We've just listened to a very powerful statement by the president of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić, which was actually broadcast last year, but it describes very carefully, with analysis and understanding, of what a politician in an independent state should say, which contrasts with the statements specifically of the United States President Donald Trump, not only in creating chaos within his own country, but also in a misunderstanding of how we actually reach peace. Now, this boggles the mind because as we talk, what has President Donald Trump done? He has reinserted the sanctions against the Russian Federation, while at the same time initiating a peace initiative in Saudi Arabia. And in turn, there is a situation in Western Europe. Specifically, I mention Western Europe rather than Eastern Europe, which states within innuendos that they want to wage war on the Russian Federation. They're in the process of recruitment. They say that this is a preemptive war on the Russian Federation because they want to prepare, obviously. They say, well, maybe in a few years from now, the Russian Federation is not going to invade us and so on. And this has become another area of lies and fabrications, but also very, very dangerous, because we're dealing with the possibility that those, and I should say that those heads of state and heads of government of the European Union, together with His Majesty's government in the United Kingdom, they are paid off, they are co-opted, and they are not acting on behalf of the people of their respective countries. There's no welfare state. The welfare state has collapsed. And they are nonetheless playing the game, and they're doing it on behalf of what we call the deep state, financial interests, and so on and so forth. But the deep state seems to be divided. And then I must also mention, since this is broadcast from Canada, that early next week, on the 4th of March, President Donald Trump is confirming that Canada and Mexico will be subjected to 25% tariff on the one hand, and that also applies to the European Union. Now, that in many regards, if we look at US history, could be described as what we might call the Boston Tea Party 2.0. And we recall how in 1773, the British East India Company came in and imposed heavy tariffs on the tea, which was being imported into the United. Well, it was not. It was British North America at that time, and that led to total havoc. It also led to smuggling, and I can tell you, the situation in Mexico and as well as in Canada, when that announcement will be, when it will be made, and if and when it is implemented, is going to create havoc on an unprecedented scale in the history of North America. So there we are. Drago has analyzed these issues from various points of view, both in terms of geopolitics, diplomacy, but also the whole issue of confronting or even waging war against the Russian Federation, which, to quote the words of President Vučić, would lead us into a catastrophic situation. And we have forgotten to state the word for peace. We are for peace. And at the same time, as we have made in earlier programs, we are for the canceling of NATO. That is the only solution. In other words, as they said in Italy, and this was a major initiative a few years ago, no guerra, no NATO. No war, no NATO. Drago, you reviewed the confrontations of Zelensky, who was received in the Oval Office. And of course, it was a press conference at the same time, which was recorded live. How do you view that?
It's I have to say, it's unlike anything I've ever seen. I think it's going to go to the annals of history of the White House as the most disturbing meeting between two heads of state ever. Because, to be honest, it actually looked more like a reality TV show of the worst kind, rather than a diplomatic exchange between two heads of state. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure most people, we're recording this on February 28th. By the time it's published, most people will have known, will have seen the videos and you know, the exchange between Zelensky and Trump, and they will know what happened. There was swearing. Trump was literally interrupting Zelensky. He didn't even let him speak, really. And he told him that he's done talking at some point.
In 2019, I signed with him the deal. I signed with him, Macron and Merkel, we signed ceasefire. Ceasefire. All of them told me that he will never go. We signed with him with gas contract. Gas contract. Yes, but after that, he broken this ceasefire. What kind of diplomacy JD, you are speaking about?
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media.
Let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
First of all, during the war, everybody has problems. Even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because
I'm
you're in no
answering on
position
this
to
question.
dictate that.
That's
Remember
exactly what
this.
you're doing.
I'm not
You're in
dictating.
no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
Or,
You're not
Mr.
in a good
Brown,
position.
I
You
was
don't have
saying-
the cards right now. With us, you start having
Not
cards.
playing
But
cards.
right now, you
I'm
don't.
very
You're playing
serious,
cards.
Mr. President.
You're
I'm
playing
very
cards.
serious.
You're
I'm
gambling
the
with the
president
lives
in
of
war.
millions of people.
You think-
You're gambling with World War
What you're-
III.
what you're
You're
speaking about?
gambling with
What you're
World
speaking
War
about?
III. And
You-
what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country.
You think that if you will speak very loudly about the war, you
He's
can...
not speaking loudly. He's not
He-
speaking loudly. Your country's
Can I-
in big
can I-
trouble.
can I
Wait a
answer?
minute. No,
Can
you've
I
done a lot of
answer?
talking. Your country is in big trouble.
I know.
You're not
I
winning.
know.
You're not winning this. You have a damn good chance of
we are
coming out
staying,
okay because of
Mr.
us.
President, we are staying in our country, staying strong from the very beginning of the war. We've been alone, and we are thankful. I said thanks
You haven't
in
been
this
alone.
cabinet,
You
and
haven't
not
been
only
alone.
in this
We
cabinet.
gave you, through
I
this
said
stupid
thank you.
president, $350 billion.
You
We
voted
gave
for
you
your
military
president.
equipment,
You
and you
voted
men
for
are
your
brave,
president.
but they had to use our military.
Yes. What about
if
West?
you didn't have
You
our
invited
military
me-
equipment,
you invited
if
me
you
to
didn't
speak.
have our military equipment, this war would have been over in 2 weeks.
In 3
okay?
days, I heard it from Putin. In 3 days, this is something
Maybe
new.
less.
In 2 weeks, of course,
It's
yes.
going to be a very hard thing to do business like this. I tell you.
After Zelensky asked for permission to speak, and also JD Vance pretty much attacked him. So what we were supposed to see, I presume, was some sort of a good cop, bad cop game, but actually two bad cops came, and this is what we have. I would, if I didn't know what sort of a person Zelensky is, I would say I felt a bit sorry for him. But given his history of supporting the neo-Nazi regime in Kiev, providing cover because of his Jewish descent, of course, he provided cover for the Nazi regime that actually killed his ancestors, and along with millions of other people in Eastern Europe, tens of millions actually. So I have no sympathy for him, although if it weren't Zelensky, I would have certainly felt sorry for someone else who would have been treated that way. But this, what happened to Zelensky is it's a lesson for anyone who thinks that they can speak on the same level as a superpower whose proxy they are. Zelensky there was this cult that was being built for Zelensky, and this has given him wings, essentially, he's been thinking that he actually makes the decisions about anything. But the point is, he was just a proxy of NATO that was supposed to be used as cannon fodder against the Russian Federation. And of course, this failed, as many experts, numerous experts, I mean, it would be impossible to name them in the next 20 minutes alone, who have been warning that this should not be done. All the files that have been leaked by various independent media have shown that numerous experts, diplomats, journalists, politicians in the West and other countries have been warning, everyone not to do this, but they still went ahead. The Russians have pretty much defeated the Ukrainian military. They're advancing across the entire front line. It's pretty clear what's going to happen to whatever is left of Ukraine. Of course, the country has been pretty much destroyed. We see the catastrophic results of Zelensky naively believing, we could argue if he believed anything where he was just ordered what to do. Anyway, we see that now Zelensky is seen as dead weight by the United States. And for Trump, this was a move that essentially makes him it gives them the opportunity to get rid of Ukraine as dead weight, and this is what he's trying to do. The whole idea of the so-called rare earth minerals agreement deal, whatever you want to call it, blackmail would be a better word, I would say. it's not going to work because, first of all, Ukraine doesn't really have a well-developed industry of rare earth mineral extraction, and it would take years, which means after the hostilities end, and we have no idea when that's going to happen, it would take years to invest in building the infrastructure, and then it would take decades essentially to have a good return on investment. And that's not going to happen anytime soon, especially because the Russians actually control the most, mineral-rich areas in Ukraine, which is in the south and the east. So that's where all the mining was. I mean, the mining was mostly done in the Donbass region, and most of that region is under Russian control now. So what we really see is Trump just trying to get rid of this ballast, essentially, because this is how he sees Ukraine and Zelensky, and they did it masterfully. Now what's going on, we have Europe, which realizes it's going to be left alone to face the Russian Federation, and they don't have the effective military power to face the Russians. So, but still, for some incredibly stupid reason, we see the United Kingdom and France pushing for more confrontation with Russia. And the biggest surprise for me was that Poland now realizes that they would be next. And now they don't want to do that. They said we will provide logistics support. We will provide, our territory for whatever operations there might be, but they will not be directly engaged in any war with Russia, as they said. And I think this is because they realize that the Russians have been fighting with a one hand tied behind their backs against the Ukrainians because they see Ukrainians as their own people. They will not have the same considerations against Poles, especially not against the French, the Germans, and the British, because they've had enough of NATO essentially causing this war and causing death and destruction in both Russia and the neighboring Ukraine. Yeah. So I think what we're going to see, hopefully not more escalation, but it seems this is what Western European powers, who are now alone, want to see, want to make sure that this happens. It's pretty crazy, I have to say.
Yeah, I think what we have to understand also that essentially now we have four leaders in Western Europe. I say Western Europe because the situation in Eastern Europe is quite different. But it's a Starmer in Britain who was an appointee of the World Economic Forum. He did his election campaign in the Swiss Alps. Macron is a proxy for the Rothschilds, and he worked for the Rothschilds. And Friedrich Merz now, which has formed the coalition government in Germany, is also very much aligned to the financial establishment more directly, and he's a multimillionaire. And on that, he's also worked for BlackRock and so on and so forth. How do you view this? Are we having some kind of split within the deep state? I mean, I don't know how to divide it in two, but we have...
Yeah, I think that's certainly the case. First of all, Trump has tried to... I mean, he's been quite successful in dismantling the deep state that's against him. And he's now setting up his own deep state in the United States. He's replacing people in the intelligence community. He's replacing people in all these federal institutions that have been extremely corrupt, that have been part of the DNC's, pretty much money laundering scheme. I don't know how else to call it, because there's been hundreds of billions of dollars that have been laundered through Ukraine and returned back to the United States, to the private pockets of God knows who. I don't want to name anyone for obvious reasons, but I think it's pretty clear to most informed people that this money was pretty much appropriated, and this is the money of the American taxpayers. It has been appropriated by private people, by private companies, private organizations who are connected to the old deep state. And of course, this is what Trump wants to dismantle. These are the people who try to kill him, after all, and he has nothing but hatred for them, obviously. So They've jeopardized his life multiple times, and he has every reason to dismantle them. However, now we see the consequences of this. So first, we have this great division in the United States itself, but there's also this division on a strategic, like geopolitical level between the United States and the rest of NATO. Now, this is a big issue for Western Europe, and we could also say for Canada, which with Trudeau actually stating that they want to connect more with Europe after the Zelensky-Trump meeting. So we see the rest of NATO now still being controlled by the old deep state, and we see Trump and his iteration of the deep state, which are struggling for power in the West now. And of course, Trump is actually ready to a certain degree to actually work with both Russia and to a certain extent even China in order to get rid of this old deep state that actually still exists in Europe. And the old deep state, of course, was adamant to go to war with Russia, and they still want this. We can see this in the behavior of Germany, of France, of the UK. We're trying to push the rest of Europe into a war. The issue is, this is sort of like a hot potato for them. They know they cannot handle Russia. They know they cannot send. They already have recruitment problems in peacetime. They can't get enough soldiers for their professional militaries. So what they would have to do, they would either have to reintroduce conscription or destroy their economies so much that people are going to get poor, because poor people, they might go to war. People who are well-fed, who have everything they need, they have no reasons to want to go to war, especially not to a place against a country like Russia, which has obviously demonstrated its ability to wipe out entire armies armed with the most sophisticated Western weapons. We've seen that even the old Soviet stocks of artillery are enough to wipe out the best that NATO has to offer. And I don't think this is only exacerbated. The last few years have exacerbated NATO's chances against Russia, because the Russians have outproduced NATO 3 or 4 times in the most important weapon systems, including artillery. So Russia, according to some estimates, produces 3 times more artillery than the entirety of NATO, including the United States. So,
Drago, I mean, there's one element. Of course, you are very knowledgeable of the weapon systems, but if you ask Ursula von Leyen, she's ignorant, and most of these leaders are ignorant on the nature of and capabilities of the Russian Federation. And we're not talking about who is more advanced. We want instruments we require a process of dialogue, which we were promised with Trump said we're going to have diplomacy and we're going to have dialogue, and in fact that started about a couple of weeks back in Saudi Arabia, and in the meantime, the conflicts between the European Union on the one hand and the Donald Trump administration on the other, because the European Union was following the lines drawn out by Joe Biden, and that was the conformity. But now we have 4 leaders: Starmer, Macron, Friedrich. I'm sorry, it's 3 leaders essentially: Starmer, Macron, and Friedrich Merz, with the so-called Christian Democrats in Germany, and they are. I mean, one element which one has to underscore. And we discussed in previous programs, when Trump called for the transformation of Gaza into an American territory, he did that on behalf of the Rothschilds. Why? Because the Rothschilds had lent him money and he was bankrupt. And that was his problem with his casino project. So in other words, I don't think there's a clear demarcation. I think the financial elites are still supporting both sides, but they're creating divisions between the United States government, the present United States government, and the leaders of the European Union. All of which, I mean, there's another interesting dimension. Europe is virtually, let's forget NATO for a moment. It has U.S. military bases all over the place. Okay, they have them. They have them in Germany, and they have them in the United Kingdom, and they have them in Italy. They don't necessarily have them in France because General de Gaulle was very took a very important stance. But what we have in what is called the West are countries which still have U.S. military facilities. Well, they're also in Turkey, they're in Belgium, they're in the Netherlands, and so on. And essentially they're in countries which are former imperial countries or colonial style countries, such as Belgium and the Netherlands and so on and so forth, and of course Turkey. And there's something very specific in that, because it really means you have militarized the European Union. And now let me turn to Canada and Mexico. Not many people in Canada and Mexico are familiar with a negotiation which took place. It took place in the wake of the Iraq War, primarily, and it led also to the resignation of our Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. It was the establishment of Northern Command. Northern Command. We have command structures of the United States throughout the world. Eurocommand commands the military bases which are in the European space or the Western European space. But this was Northern Command, and it includes and it was signed by both the Mexican government as well as the Canadian government. It allows for the United States of America to literally invade militarily, with troops, even for peace purpose, or to go after terrorists or whatever. And there you have a territory that starts in the Caribbean and that goes up to the Arctic, and which is contiguous, of course, to Greenland. Now, people don't know about that, but the countries which are the main allies of the United States of America, they are occupied by U.S. troops. And I'm not talking about the NATO bases. Well, there's some which are common, NATO and U.S. But here we are, what is emerging is a situation where, of course, it's very convenient. Not only these are the victims of U.S. military occupation, but they're also allies. Okay, and for those reasons, we might, of course, want to have regime change in every single country in Western Europe, okay, to restore the post-war era welfare state, because those heads of state and heads of government are serving the interests of a foreign power. They're also serving the interests of the economic elites, of the billionaires, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, there's a danger of global warfare. Now, when I say global warfare, it's a term that the Pentagon will use, because they have had numerous scenarios of global warfare, considering that there are essentially 3 or 4 or 5 war theaters. But let's say there's Russia, the Eastern Front, then there's China, and China also includes North Korea, and then there's the Middle East, where they're heavily involved. And we might say that in the Western Hemisphere, it doesn't mean that it's a military operation necessarily, but it's regime change, it's neoliberal policies, and so on. It's the new Monroe Doctrine. I guess that would be MAGA, Make America Great Again, and ensure that all those Latin American countries will abide by the Trump diktats. So that is the world in which we are today, and how can we establish a peace agreement, a peaceful process? And we have discussed this, and I think that our mandate is essentially to dismantle the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And that is not an impossibility. But it also requires, there's a protest movement at the base. They're all funded by Wall Street, most of them. I don't want to mention any names of Open Society Institute or whatever, but they are funded. So they have a progressive opposition. It's what we would call manufacturing dissent, but it's financed by the same people who are supporting the governments. Okay, now I think that as you pointed out, Drago, in Eastern Europe, the possibilities of one or more countries leaving the North Atlantic Treaty Organization are there. Orban in Hungary, and then also in the Czech Republic, and at the same time in Romania. But again, this is no easy task, but it is necessary to have a mass movement of people who are against war. They should be against NATO, but another element, and that's where ideology comes in, they should be firmly opposed to their governments giving support to a Nazi regime. Now, that is a criminal act. In German law, it's a criminal act. So if Friedrich Merz is going to support the Kiev government under German law, he is supporting the Holocaust. He's supporting Nazi Germany. Okay? Why? Because the Azov battalion and all the elements which control that junta, as you say, they are Nazis, and they're Nazis going back. The history of Nazism in Ukraine, but specifically Western Ukraine, goes back to World War II, and they collaborated, and they certainly killed a lot of people in concentration camps. Now, what is it when we have a whole bunch of European leaders who said we must support Kiev, knowing that Kiev is a Nazi regime? So there are two elements. One is we have NATO supporting Nazism, okay? And that's also true for the United States of America. And then we have to say the only way really to bring the term of this war is no guerra, no NATO. No war, no NATO, and no support to Nazi proxy governments. Why? Because if you are head of state or head of government, a legal suit could be launched against you by the peace movement because it's illegal to support the Nazis. And Starmer should know that as well. And it is also anti-Semitic to support the Nazis. Now, when Starmer, who says he's respective of the rights of Jews and so on, he should understand that every single action by those European countries is anti-Semitic. If you support the Nazi government in Ukraine, you are anti-Semitic because you support the Holocaust.
I think it's important that they first acknowledge the fact that they are supporting a Nazi government. But what they're doing is they're maintaining plausible deniability by saying, oh, look at Zelensky, he's of Jewish descent. Obviously, the government is not a Nazi government. And that's their main framework from which they start everything. Like every conversation about Zelensky, about Ukraine, about the neo-Nazis, it starts from there. So they will say, oh, there might have been some extremist right-wing groups, but they've become democrats ever since. They're fighting the good fight. They're fighting the evil Russians and so on and so on. This is all the same narrative that we've been listening for the last 3 years or longer, because the war started in 2014. It was initiated by NATO, by the CIA, by the US. So the problem is Europe needs to have a change of power, of political power, in order to acknowledge what you just said, the fact that this is a Nazi government led by the descendants of literal Nazis from World War II, of people who came from the likes of Bandera and Shukovich and Melnik and so on. Of course, this will never happen. The current people in power, the current political structure in Europe, it will never do this. They will never admit the fact that they're still supporting a Nazi government, because that would be politically and geopolitically extremely inconvenient. So I think it's important what you said. There needs to be a change a change on the level of the state, of every state in Europe, particularly people who are trying to push back against this. We see this in Romania. The Romanian candidate for peace, Călin Gheorghescu, has been arrested a few days ago. He was released in the meantime, but now there are rumors that he might be banned from politics, which means they want to make sure that no peace candidate comes to power in a country like Romania, because it's a battlefront country, because it borders Ukraine, and it's a big country. It's very important for NATO's strategy in Eastern Europe, and which also, as you said, includes the United States, because the United States has a very important anti-ballistic missile base in the country, in a place called Devuselo. So the point is, this is extremely, of course, there needs to be a peace initiative, but this is an extremely complex process, because right now we have converging interests of several parties.
There's just one element which is very important there. The NATO members continue to fund Nazi initiatives. I mean, there's the camps for children where they indoctrinate these kids. It's all very well documented. In fact, it's even documented by the Ukrainian media. But the thing is that the reason, and I know that the media doesn't want to, they've been instructed, you don't mention Nazis in your reports, okay? You don't mention it. Now, we have all the proofs. The independent media has the proof that this is a Nazi government. We don't need to. And we also have several mainstream media reports which have the honesty of mentioning this, both in the United States, in Canada, in Western Europe. In other words, I think we have to also challenge the role of the mainstream media. It's not an issue of fact checking, okay? The facts are there. We've got them. It's what they're doing. They're excluding the facts from their reports. And if we say, oh, they're Nazis, that's a conspiracy theory. No, it's not. It's not. And we have statements from prominent Jewish personalities which will confirm this. So in other words, the whole issue of combating anti-Semitism is twisted. Starmer in the United Kingdom is arresting people who are in solidarity with Palestine, but why doesn't he arrest himself? Because he is supporting a regime in Ukraine which is a Nazi government, and there is evidence that those two parties, the right sector and Svoboda, are linked up, or historically linked up, to the atrocities committed in World War II against Jews and other the Romas. They also Poles as well in the city of Lvov. We have the data on that. We have it. Now, it is illegal to relate with a government which is Nazi. Punto.
Yeah, I mean, it should be mentioned, these people were also killing Ukrainians. The data varies significantly, but at least between 6 to 8 million people were killed in Ukraine. So out of 27 million people killed on the territory of former Soviet Union, 6 to 8 were Ukrainians, the vast majority of whom were civilians. And these people who are now in power in the country, their ancestors were the guards in these death camps. They were part of the death squads that were going around, including the SS Galicia, going around killing people who were considered unfit, die Untermenschen, or subhumans, and so on. All the minorities that you mentioned, the Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, Roma, of course, Jews, because they were the first to be targeted. So these people, the point is, these people had no significant support in the country. Even in 2014, when the war was launched by NATO, these people had only maybe 5% of the support, and mostly in the far western parts of the country.
That's right.
However, when the Ukrainian people actually voted for Zelensky because he presented himself as the candidate of peace. And he was telling completely different things to what he's saying now or in the last 3 or 4 years. So what he was saying is, we need to unite the country. We need to allow the Russian speakers to speak their language, embrace their culture, whatever. However, these extremely aggressive people who were financed and empowered by the CIA and other NATO run intelligence agencies, they pushed these people into power. And these people are the ones who control Zelensky. Zelensky, this is why I say he's just a front man. He's a puppet. He's a proxy of these people. Anything he does, anything he says, needs to be sanctioned by these neo-Nazi or Nazi proxies who control the country. They are a very aggressive minority, and they've been using the country. It's important to understand these people don't see Ukrainians as their own people. They see them as cannon fodder to be used against Russia. And this is what they're doing. This is why they're going around the streets of Ukrainian cities and towns and villages, kidnapping people and then sending them off to the front line. There are videos of these people who have been forcibly conscripted, of them who are handcuffed in military trucks being sent off to the front line. And then they are dropped off at the front line, given a rusty AK-47, and then told defend against one of the largest superpowers in the history of mankind. So this is a losing fight. These people are dying for nothing. According to various estimates, upwards of 1 million of them have died, which is a genocide in and of itself. So this is another genocide, because we already had the Holocaust in World War II, when Jews and all these other people were killed, especially Slavs, who were targeted as subhumans, as so-called subhumans. Now we have the same thing happening again. We have millions of refugees. We have millions of people who have been maimed for life. There are literally between 2 and 3 million people who have been maimed for life in Ukraine right now. These are people who are not going to be economically viable for the country in the future, which means they need to be taken care of. And who's going to do that if the country is empty, if it's economically unsustainable, especially now, because we see that they want the European Union and these other NATO governments, they want to see the war to continue. So the problem is we have a bunch of these converging interests of various alliances, as you said multiple times, these cross-cutting alliances, where we have at the moment Trump, who is ready to work with Russia because it's in his geopolitical and internal interest to do that, not because he's interested in peace, but this is something that he needs as a stopgap measure until he takes most of Europe under his control. This is what he's trying to do by openly supporting the populist governments. So we have that, and we have the old deep state that controls NATO and the European Union. And they not only they want to stay in power, but they also want to wage war against Russia. And in order to do that, they also need to establish control over countries, non-compliant countries in Eastern Europe. And that especially includes Orban's Hungary and Fico's Slovakia. There's also Poland, which has stated it doesn't want to participate in a war. It wants to support the war logistically. We'll see how that's going to go. But they have the issue that there are many governments in Eastern Europe that are very friendly to Trump, that want to establish an alliance with Trump. And these countries might be a part of this pro-Trump or Trumpist coalition within Europe that might actually break apart the European Union at some point. Maybe not directly, but there are already divisions within the bloc. And I think we're going to see these divisions grow.
Yeah, well, I think what you describe is of course, very, very complex. And there are no easy solutions, but there's also the dangers of decision-making, cross-cutting decision-making. It's not, we talked about cross-cutting alliances. That certainly is a factor. And in Eastern Europe, we know that in Eastern Europe how the Cold War impacted. I recall it. The wages in Bulgaria collapsed to something like, I mean, these were figures, whether we believe them or not, but it went below $10 a month. Okay. And that was in several of these countries, they were the victims. They didn't necessarily realize that this was the victims of neoliberal policies, which was there to impoverish them. But I think what we have to understand now is to, in a sense, to break the whole process of world wars. Now, the world wars started. We can look at the post-World War I period, and it's of interest that there was a war against Russia, which dates January 1918. If I recall correctly, it was on the 12th of January 1918. It was a NATO-style invasion. Japanese were involved, the British and the United States, Canada. It was not there fighting on behalf of the deposed emperor, the Tsar. it was an outright invasion of the Soviet Union, which lasted for about 2 years. But what we have to understand is that there's a history of wars and Cold Wars going back more than 100 years. And at this stage, I think we are in a position to at least have a ceasefire between NATO countries and the United States, in terms of the negotiations which have just started, but which are the object of sabotage, essentially. But I think, from my standpoint, from our standpoint, it is to create conditions whereby the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is no longer functional. And that should be maybe 1 or 2 countries in Eastern Europe who decide to go against NATO. It's also an issue of economic warfare, and people in Western Europe must realize that their governments are there impoverishing them by accepting the neoliberal policy measures, which largely are the consequence of very high prices of energy. And that, of course, has a lot to do with the sabotage of Nord Stream. But the issue there is we must work progressively towards the dismantling of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And we cannot have any real democracy unless we democratize every single entity of the nation state. So it's not, it means we democratize health, we democratize defense, we democratize the economic agenda, the fiscal modalities, and so on. And it's not simply having people protesting. The protests must also come within the structures of the state apparatus. I think we are committed to retaining the welfare state and the sovereign, what we call the sovereign nation state. And we are there in a battle, a long-standing battle of the financial elites, which means also the Federal Reserve, the wealthy families, BlackRock, and so on. It's taken on a different dimension now with these portfolio investment firms. The real actors there are always in the shadows. They'll get Bill Gates to do some dirty tricks, or maybe Elon Musk is a different nature to Bill Gates, but I don't want to get into that or personalize. But we have to democratize the entire structure of the nation state, including the military, and that is not as easy task. But the first thing would be to remove NATO from the landscape totally, and that is something which is feasible, and which I
couldn't agree more. And we can see that NATO is trying to convince anyone who refuses to go to war. We see that they're always trying to convince other countries to accept it. And this was the mission of Starmer and Macron when they went to the United States, when they had the meeting with Trump. They were trying to convince him, all of Trump's flaws notwithstanding, the good thing about him is he doesn't want a war with Russia. He understands that this is suicidal. He understands that even a conventional war with Russia is a very bad idea. His understanding of military technologies and many other things is very limited, but this is something that he understands from the people who do understand these things. They told him that he accepted it. On the other hand, we see that Europe, Western Europe, is still trying to push for a war with Russia, and they know they need the help of the United States to do that. Trump actually didn't even want to have the meeting with Zelensky, but Macron actually he put him up to it, and then he accepted, and then we had the disastrous meeting that we had today. And of course, the result of this is going to be negative for NATO, which of course is a good thing in the grand scheme of things, because any sort of disunity in NATO means that the alliance cannot act as a one. This offensive alliance cannot act as one body, as was the case during the Biden administration, and it cannot go around the world and attack other countries. Of course, we might see Trump going on his own and trying to impose his will on other countries, as he's doing now to Mexico and Canada and Denmark, and to a large degree also the European Union, because he's also threatening Europe with these 25% tariffs on all of their goods. So we can see that this is going to leave disastrous economic consequences on Europe and all these other countries that I mentioned, and the US itself, because of course US production economy has pretty much been outsourced to third world countries, as they say, or the global south, whatever you want to call it. And now it's not very easy. Trump wants to take all this production economy back to the United States, but this is not easy because American wages don't allow for an easy reindustrialization, because simply this economy with such high wages would make the American production economy non-competitive, because the Chinese are producing something that is of similar or better quality, but it's much cheaper. It's 10 times cheaper, or even 2 times cheaper. It's still going to dominate the market.
Even more than that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it might be 100 times cheaper. I'm just like hypothetically speaking, of course.
Well, it's not, but maybe not 100 times cheaper. I think we have to complete our discussion, and I think as well as emphasize very clearly the avenue which is required by the anti-war movement, as well as by the governments, that NATO has to go. I think that will, of course, it's there to establish a peaceful relationship between East and West, but it has much broader implications in that the Russians have always wanted, throughout their history, to collaborate with Western Europe, and that is something which the United States, as a so-called imperial power, has attempted to block for more than a whole century. So, dear readers, I will complete this debate and kindly request your support to the producers of this program, which is Lux Media. It's an independent media based in Montreal, and also very important because we live in an era of censorship. This video production can be forwarded. We thank Rumble for hosting it, and then also as an independent media, the Center for Research on Globalization, based in Montreal, also requests its support, but that support can also be granted by simply forwarding this video, which will, in the next 24 hours, which is going to come out in several languages, so that we reach a large readership. When I say several languages, it's in English and then subtitles into a number of languages, of countries which are, of course, affected by what's going on worldwide. Again, and thanks to Drago for his incisive and carefully documented understanding of what is happening to the world.
The pleasure was all mine. Hopefully we can contribute to world peace, and I mean, this is our modest contribution, and I think even if we can affect the lives of 100 people or 10 people in a positive way, that makes all of this worth it.
Absolutely.